The Art to Equality project is something that the National Park asked us to do. Are there any national parks that speak to you? And that's what this Art to Equality project is about. Are you included?
During the 2016-2017 academic year, Kutztown University's Frederick Douglass Institute and the National Park Service partnered together to engage in part of their program called Art to Equality. So there's three parts to the Art to Equality program at Kutztown University through our Frederick Douglass Institute. The first part is our think tank that met all during the academic year in the fall and the spring, for the most part every other week. And the second part of the program was the identification of 5 interns that actually studied 5 different national parks of their choice and visited those parks and wrote a research report. And the third part of our project was a social justice teach-in where we identified a national park, we researched that national park, and we partnered with the Fort Worth School District Junior ROTC to visit a national park and teach about issues of equality and social justice at that national park. Our students chose the Minuteman National Site, missile site up in South Dakota and Sioux Falls area, and we did that in April of 2017. The think tank in the fall explored very general, broad questions to start. I asked them what they already knew about the national parks, and do you feel connected or disconnected with the national parks? With that broad question, the students started to research on their own on their own time, and what they found on the internet, and they explored the national park website in detail.
I feel like personally, living my life in, polluted cities and, with filth and stuff, and light pollution, I feel like it's my duty to go to visit different national parks, not like, the ones that are inside the city, like the ones in DC and New York City or Philadelphia, but the ones out in, that are vast and are the ones that are huge, to, feel the difference between, being so secluded in the city rather than being outdoors and being able to see the stars and stuff. And I feel like the National Park website should be, advertising these national parks as kind of like as a way to get away from the city. And
the second part of the project were the student interns. There were 5 national parks that the interns chose. Those parks included Edison, Gettysburg, Hopewell Furnace, Valley Forge, and Shenandoah. Those choices were made based upon student interests.
Hey, it's Katie. And it's Jordan. And we are at Hopewell Furnace in Elverson, Pennsylvania. It's a National Historic Site.
There's 25 reasons why you should visit the national park. Number 1 is that with all the technology we have today, we sort of lose an appreciation for the world and all the beauty that it has to offer.
The student interns were history majors, and the topics that they enjoyed the most were topics that they have done a lot of previous research about in other classes.
2016 is the 100-year anniversary of the National Park Service.
The newer sites, they found more diverse in the stories that were told. For example, Hopewell Furnace in Berks County, Pennsylvania was a newer site, even though the main story of that site reflects colonial times, that because the site was created in the 1970s, I believe, the student intern felt that the stories of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, influenced the stories that were told at those sites. In other words, they found that African American and women's stories were told at Hopewell Furnace, Their hypothesis is that those stories were told because those sites were created post 1950. In the spring, the think tank changed gears. We had 20 new students, and the think tank actually was part of a class where there was credit. And having credit and giving assignments allowed the students to dedicate more time and rewards as a benefit of doing an assignment. With that, the think tank changed gears. In the fall, we asked the question very generically, what national parks attract you, what stories are being told, whose stories are included, whose stories are excluded. What I found from the fall is that students really didn't know that much about their own personal identities to be able to tell us whether they felt included or excluded in the stories of the national parks. After identifying personality characteristics as part of identity, the second part of the think tank study in the spring centered on understanding one's cultural background. And we discovered and learned about culture related to gender, race, ethnicity, religion, region, many different categories. Religion as well as region were included with ability, disability, social class, etc. Students learned about themselves. Their response was that they had never in high school explored who they were culturally, and we felt that was necessary before we looked at national parks a second time around with the think tank, so that the students would have some elements by which they would use to analyze the national parks and their stories that they told. In the fall, without studying identity first, many of the African American and Latino young men in the think tank expressed their desire to go to places that were different from where they grew up. They wanted to go to open spaces in the Midwest, in the West, and walk in nature and go someplace that didn't identify with their cultural background as much as a place that was different that they could explore from their home environment, from their city, from their neighborhood. In the spring, however, after studying about one's culture and history related to race and ethnicity, many of the young African American males and Latinx males were very interested in national parks related to their racial background and the civil rights movement specifically. Many of those individuals created projects and videos about national parks related to the civil rights movement. One of the activities that we engaged in during our Arc to Equality project at Kutztown University was to invite Dr. Megan Springate from the DC Office of Cultural Interpretation to our university. She is the editor of the LGBTQ theme study, and she spoke in an auditorium to many students and met with small groups as well concerning that study and many topics that the national park interprets related to race, class, gender, and orientation. The last part of the Arc to Equality project at Kutztown University was our social justice teach-in. We've engaged at a social justice teach-in 2 years ago when we took part in the Selma to Montgomery 50th anniversary march, and last year at Gettysburg. This year we wanted to be at the Minuteman Missile National Park and Site to study the Cold War. And we wanted to engage in our social justice teach-in at that location because it gave us an opportunity to study modern history and also incorporate everything that we've learned about multiple stories related to race, gender, social class to that site. We didn't know that much about it, so the students researched that topic through the spring semester. Another part of the social justice teach-in is to have high school students in a location in the United States study about a similar topic in a different location through their own eyes. We partnered with Fort Worth independent school district in Texas, and we worked with the JROTC. And there, 20 cadets learned about the Cold War and studied topics related to different events that happened during the Cold War. Their job was to come to the Minuteman Missile National Site with our college students from Kutztown University and teach us about the Cold War. Kutztown University students studied issues about the Cold War related to race, class, and gender. Our job in the social justice teach-in was to teach high school students from Fort Worth about topics of inclusion that would not necessarily be taught through the historic site, the Minuteman Missile National Site. The social justice teach-in this year was unique in that not only did we have high school students teach college students and college students teach high school students at a national park location, we added a new dimension to our social justice teach-in. We videotaped veterans who are instructors in the JROTC in Fort Worth, and we asked them to describe their experience serving in the military during the Cold War. 3 college students from Kutztown University, as part of the Frederick Douglass Institute initiative, Arc to Equality, taught high school students about issues related to social justice off-site near the Minuteman Missile National Site. Our students chose 3 topics. Carolyn chose to teach students about work and workers related to creating the missile silos in South Dakota. Chanel chose to teach about gender and women in the military during the time that the missile silos in South Dakota were active near the Minuteman Missile National Site. Maya chose a lesson that looked at the historical context of opportunities for females and persons of color in the military during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Her lesson centered on students and boxes that society may place them in and societal oppression, both then and during the period in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then boxes that still exist today. So the job of Kutztown University Frederick Douglass Institute this year was to have students brainstorm their opinions about national park sites, about historical stories that are included or not included at national park sites, and share their insights with national park personnel. This short video was created for the purpose of sharing their thoughts with you.
They were able to, sense what we were interested in and what we weren't interested in, and they answered our questions very thoroughly. And I enjoyed it a lot. It just, my perception of what, the national park system completely changed. And it opened me up to a whole new way of thinking, a whole new chapter of history that I wasn't necessarily exposed to.
So that really changed just how I view museums and view museums and I guess view history altogether. Because I always would go in looking at it from this social history, industrial history point of view, and looking at the aspects of that related to the research that I was interested in and the history that I was interested in. But being with the group and going in looking for something different, I don't know.
Even like this, we just met these kids, and some of them say that this is something that they're not gonna ever forget. So I guess that is always the things like that count. So.
The Arc to Equality project at Kutztown University Frederick Douglass Institute has been a life-changing opportunity for some young folks that had an opportunity to go to the national parks. This project has been more a matter of aiding adolescents in their transition to adulthood, specifically what we see as students not tapping into their racial, cultural, ethnic, gender backgrounds as much as tapping into different tasks related to the movement from adolescence to adulthood. More specifically, students tended to enjoy and seem to get a lot out of understanding and studying their identity and who they were, whether it was elements of their personality or their cultural constructs.
Forward, JLTC, Mount Rushmore!
On the way home from South Dakota, we drove on a bus for 6 hours back to Denver. And during that time, we interviewed each JROTC cadet as to what they learned during the social justice teach-in and the ARC the Equality project that they participated in. They gave a variety of answers. Some of the answers had to do with what they learned about the civil rights movement, the Cold War, and a lot about themselves.
People had to just sit in a launch center for 24 hours at a time sometimes. And it might not seem like a hard job, but that's really mentally and physically and emotionally hard on somebody. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and that's something that I learned.
Here's some things from you. What is something that you learned about the Cold War and social justice?
Well, about the Cold War, I learned more about the Cold War, like things that we already knew, but more explained and more in detail than we did. Like, for example, like how is the Minutemen 1 and 2 different from the Minutemen 3 and stuff like that.
I didn't realize how hard people were fighting for civil rights, you know? Like how hard they were like trying to improve their environment, and yeah, I mean, and it's like real inspiring how women were like, hey, I know I'm fragile, but I still can do it. Homosexual people were like, no, because I like different things that people think that I should like, means that I don't deserve a job, or yeah, you know.
Awesome.
Another result of the ARC the Equality project here at Kutztown University was finding out about the importance and the effectiveness of experiential learning. This JROTC students that participated in this project spoke extensively about the different learning strategies that they engaged in during this project, more specifically active learning and experiential learning, and they talked about how they learned more during this project than they might have in the classroom.
Well, I had a great time working with it, and I learned a ton, more than I probably learned at through any university class honestly. So and taking it out of the classroom and talking to real people, it's just been a really great experience.
Yesterday, while we were at the museum, a girl named Karen came up to me and was like, "Can I please take a picture with all of you guys, please?" And that was just the spark. It was like a domino effect. We started interacting with a lot of other students. At lunch, we were talking about what it meant to be Texan and, how they grew up. And I told them, how I grew up, and there is not much difference from us, other than a couple of, years in age. But being able to have that conversation with them and to hear that I had an impact on them, it meant a lot to me.
Another result of the project was that JROTC students talked about their own personal vision of themselves, perspectives of being an African American or perspectives of being a woman, and connections between those perspectives or newly found perspectives with topics in history and current events.
Definitely have to mention the connections, between world events, what was happening back home, what was happening worldwide. I've never seen those correlated, and for your professor to have those lined up like that was really interesting. It makes me want to look more into it when I get home. Seriously, it really does.
Anything for social justice?
For social justice, I learned just how improved or expanded our roles were. Their minority what the roles were. Considering women, African Americans, it was a time when it was very changed. Again, that effect thing. It's interesting to see how that works.
At the very beginning of our week together in South Dakota, I asked the students if they felt excluded or included in the national park system. After spending an entire week studying topics related to the Cold War, civil rights, and visiting 3 different sites, the Minuteman Missile National Site, the Badlands, and Mount Rushmore, I asked them at the end, do they feel included or excluded in the national parks? This is what they said.
Generally, there can be a sense of exclusion. It's just something you never really think about. You know, it's not something that's, of course, it's not put in the forefront of, you know, you're not represented here. But it's definitely something that I would have to say I feel more excluded on, you know, if I'm giving an honest answer than included.
I would say as a white female that I could kind of feel a sense of both in a way. I could feel included in the fact that they did mention women, you know, during our tours and stuff without having somebody to ask them about women. So they, you know, went out of their way to actually mention us and like what we did. But I feel excluded in the sense that there's nothing there that really represents women. They didn't have like a section about women in the museums or the parks, or they didn't have like, you know, monuments represent women. So I guess I felt excluded in the fact that they didn't represent that in the museum. They just didn't talk about it.
And
I feel a little bit of both with race. Hispanic, I kind of felt included because when we saw Mount Rushmore as white men, then when we saw Crazy Horse as Native American. So I was kind of feeling included, but at the same time I felt excluded because you don't see a big, you know, stone of a woman or something out there, or, you know, so it just made me feel kind of excluded with that.
We at Kutztown University Frederick Douglass Institute want to thank the National Park Service for this grant, ARC Equality Grant. We learned a lot about ourselves, we learned about cultural groups, we learned a lot about America's history, but most of all we learned a lot about kids. University students as well as high school students. We gained a lot of insight into experiential learning and the importance of experiential learning, and the importance of discussing topics related to race and class and gender, sexual orientation, region, religion, all diversity topics with young people, because what we found out is these topics just aren't discussed in the universities and the high schools, and our students were not that knowledgeable about themselves before coming to the national parks. This experience helped both university students and high school students find out more about their own personal identities, experience autonomy by traveling to a faraway place, and developing interpersonal relationships which hopefully will last a lifetime. Thank you so much for this opportunity.